Hey everyone, it's me, Tim.
And me, Camille. And we're starting today's show on Cherokee Street.
Yeah, this stretch of road in South St. Louis is sort of like a petri dish for some of the area's most creative small businesses. There's a great co-working space, bars, restaurants, a head shop.
We're here to meet up with one of the city's best-known small business owners, Lou Prince.
For decades, he owned a vintage vinyl record store in a different part of town, the Del Mar Loop.
When we started it in 1979, based on never selling the hits, that, we figured the chains could sell the top 100 and we would deal with the much more musically literate part of the population.
Lou's in his mid-60s. He gives off sort of a hippie vibe mixed with some serious business smarts.
And while growing vintage vinyl from a booth at a farmer's market to a multi-million-dollar business, he got involved in politics.
He wasn't so much interested in candidates, though. He liked issues.
Minimum wage, which raises the wages of the people who need it the most, and national health care. So I'm always sort of up for that.
So one day, a little more than a decade ago, Lou is sitting in his office looking at a computer screen.
I got an email. I was sitting at my desk at Vintage Vinyl, and it was a kind of a, if you believe the minimum wage ought to go up, sign this petition thing. I signed it, my business partner, Tom Ray, signed it, and we sent it back in, and a couple of days later, I got an email or a call from an office in Washington, D.C. saying, you signed this thing, do you want to help us out with it? And at the time I went, there are way bigger, way more important businesses. We're just this little record store in St. Louis. And they were like, well, we only had about 10 people sign up in the entire state of Missouri. And you were the only one anyone recognized.
Lou eventually agreed, and he helped get an initiative on the ballot in 2006 that would raise the minimum wage in Missouri to $6.50 an hour, which was higher than the required federal law at the time.
So he starts going around the city drumming up support for this effort and making variations of this pitch to Rotary clubs in rural parts of the state.
Look around you and count how many minimum wage employees you have, which you can usually count on one hand. Now look at how many minimum wage customers you have. Wouldn't you love to put 30 or 40 or 50 bucks a week into their pocket?
And when it was all said and done, 75% of voters in the state of Missouri said yes.
Okay, so skip forward to this summer 2017. By this time, Lou's retired from the record business. He's splitting his time between St. Louis and New Orleans.
My wife was going, go do something. You're driving me nuts.
And then, one day, the phone rings.
When I got the call, I was sort of appalled that they didn't have somebody younger, somebody sort of more in tune. I mean, I feel, one of the reasons I got out of the record business was, I'm 65 years old, and it's a youth culture business,
Lou, once again, was being asked to help raise the minimum wage in St. Louis. But this time, it was way different than 2006.
Because, months earlier, St. Louis's Board of Aldermen, basically the city council, had approved raising the minimum wage here to $10 an hour, and the mayor had signed it into law.
But after thousands of workers in the Democratic stronghold of St. Louis got the raise, the mostly Republican state legislature voted to take it away.
You may have seen or heard headlines about this. In fact, we know many of you did.
Yes, we got the emails.
Because Tim and I started getting a bunch of emails this summer asking people, what's going on in St. Louis? Are they really decreasing people's wages?
And the short answer is, yeah, they are.
But today's show isn't about that short answer. It's about the long one.
The story of how and why the city is locked in this battle.
And the growing movement to keep up the fight to raise the standard of living for thousands of low-wage workers in this state.
It's a relatively small amount of money that makes a very large difference in the lives of the people who get it.
From St. Louis Public Radio and PRX, this is We Live Here, a show for people somewhere on the woke spectrum.
After being drafted once again into the fight for a higher minimum wage this summer, Lou took his wife's advice. He got out the house and headed to South St. Louis.
Yeah, knocking on doors and hitting up businesses to ask if they'd be willing, despite what the law said, to keep paying workers at least $10 an hour.
He knew just where to start the effort, dubbed by activists as Save the Raise.
Cherokee Street is kind of the epitome of American entrepreneuring in a recovering city. You know, this is a recovering city.
Lou says a pattern emerged among the people who decided to keep paying the higher wage. They're mostly small business owners, community-minded, and range in age from somewhere in their 20s to somewhere in their 40s.
Many are entrepreneurs, he says, and might even be exempt from raising pay because of how few people they employ, though a few of the region's big breweries also signed on.
Well, they range from, like Elaine's, which is a small restaurant. I think she has one employee. Uh-huh. You know, she's a chef, to places like Nebula, which is owned by a guy who owns 3 different businesses on the street.
And it's pretty easy to spot which businesses support the effort. Those that do have posted a sign in their windows with the words, "We pay the fair wage."
You see these signs all over the city, though certain places like Cherokee Business District are packed with them. In fact, Lou's done pretty well. He's signed up more than 140 businesses in 6 weeks.
By the last few days I was here, people were buttonholing me saying, "So how do I get my sign? So how do I sign up?"
Now,
dun dun dun.
Politics.
In America.
No, so we should probably step back a second and set the stage for this whole saga in St. Louis.
To do that, we're going to go back to February of 2007, the last time the federal government passed a minimum wage increase, going from $5.15 an hour to $7.25 an hour.
And when the bill cleared the U.S. Senate, the floor debate turned into this bipartisan love fest.
Yeah, here's Republican Mike Enzi of Wyoming just before the final vote.
Now, I want to reiterate my hope that our colleagues in the House will not derail this bipartisan approach.
And then later on, former Democratic Chairman Harry Reid of Nevada gives props to Enzi and the late Senator Ted Kennedy.
That they are an example of how people with different political philosophy can do things constructively.
Republican Mitch McConnell of Kentucky basically cuts Reid off so he can get in on some shout-outs.
Our colleagues, Senator Grassley, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, for his important contribution.
And then Reid gets back into the action.
Jogs my memory that I should have mentioned my friend, Senator Baucus, who he and Senator Grassley also...
And then a unicorn walks through the Senate chambers and starts handing out ice cream cones.
It was like the craziest
It was so
thing.
magical.
Okay, that last part didn't happen.
No, that did not.
But I mean, you get the point. Bipartisan cooperation to raise wages for American workers.
It does kind of sound like a total fantasy right now, doesn't it?
One that was too good to last.
Fast forward to 2014, and once again, the minimum wage was back in political headlines. With Republicans controlling the House of Representatives, it became basically impossible to raise the minimum wage on a federal level. So former President Barack Obama implored activists to put the wage increase up for statewide votes.
To every mayor, governor, state legislator in America, I say you don't have to wait for Congress to act. Americans will support you if you take this on.
Five states ended up taking up the president's offer. Missouri wasn't one of them. But just across the Mississippi River from our studio in St. Louis, a minimum wage increase did make it onto the ballot.
All right, so we do have to put a little asterisk next to this part, though. In Illinois, this minimum wage increase was not binding, which basically means businesses, even if it did pass, didn't have to put the raise in place. But supporters said if it passed, then legislators would have the political momentum they needed to pass a bill that would mandate raising the minimum wage.
Basically, it would be kind of like the people could show the politicians and the businesses, yeah, we want this, or yeah, we don't. And this approach got the support of Democratic heavyweights like U.S. Senator Dick Durbin.
In years gone by, this was a bipartisan issue. Republican presidents like Ronald Reagan raised the minimum wage. It was just considered to be the right thing to do after a period of time, but now it's become very partisan.
But Democrats weren't just supporting the minimum wage ballot initiatives because they supported the policy. In Illinois, then Democratic Governor Pat Quinn was facing a tough re-election campaign.
And a minimum wage increase on the ballot could boost Democratic turnout. a point Durbin hinted at in an interview with St. Louis Public Radio.
Well, I can tell you that a lot of people who just basically think off-year elections aren't that important may think twice.
When the votes were counted, though, it didn't do much for vulnerable Democratic U.S. Senate and gubernatorial candidates back then. All of them lost.
But voters did tell legislators in Illinois they approved of raising the minimum wage. And voters in 4 other states bypassed their state legislatures and approved ballot initiatives that did, in fact, raise the minimum wage. In the background, city-level efforts continued to pick up steam across the country.
Activists and labor unions were successful getting wage increases in places like Los Angeles, Seattle, and Santa Fe. And in mid-2015, politicians here in St. Louis got the mayor to sign on to a wage boost.
It is a moral imperative that this country take a serious look at how we treat our workers.
This is Alderman Shane Cohn of St. Louis during a press conference.
I, as an American, do not believe that anyone who works a full-time schedule should have to struggle with basic realities of life.
But opposition quickly mounted. Neighboring St. Louis County, which has 3 times as many people as the city, wasn't going to raise the minimum wage. And detractors said that if the city did raise its minimum wage, it would have a domino effect.
They were worried that small business owners would just pack up and go down the road to the county. And Michael Muser, who owns Pogue Label and Screen, said, yeah, that's what he was going to do.
We're in the packaging industry, and we're high labor. Labor is 50% of my cost. If you add another 30 or 40% to my cost on labor, it effectively prices us out of the game.
Still, these types of arguments weren't compelling enough for city aldermen. And after a really, really lengthy debate, they ultimately agreed to raise the city's minimum wage to $11 an hour by 2018. They would require most businesses to pay employees at least $10 an hour starting in May 2017.
Rasheed Aldrich, who was a prominent activist in Ferguson and part of the Ferguson Commission, led the celebration after the final vote. It's a little hard to make out the tape here. It's not the best, but I think you get the sense of enthusiasm.
So the Board of Aldermen today actually passed the minimum wage bill. So now working families.
But coming up, the minimum wage saga continues.
We've known for about a month that, well, this is going to get reversed. Not necessarily knowing if my company or any other company would decide, no, we're going to keep this for you guys.
Springtime in St. Louis, it's really beautiful here. The trees start blooming. Snow is gone.
I'm a sucker for a city waking up from a winter slumber.
Yeah, you guys, regular listeners, know that Camille, not a fan of the cold weather.
This is true. I know I'm not the only one.
Mm-mm.
And for the thousands of workers soon to have a little extra in their pockets this spring, things looked extra rosy this past May.
There was a buzz. There was a buzz, not only in my heart, but in those that work with me. People are going, okay, well, I'll be able to do this in a couple of months. I'll be able to do that in a couple of months. My name is Dennis Shaw. I am a worker with Schnucks Culinaria downtown.
And Dennis lives downtown, too, with his girlfriend and her 3 children. Money is tight.
Dennis makes $8.30 an hour at the grocery store, where people are expected to work all areas.
This evening, you would find me making sandwiches.
This spring, though, Dennis and his friends were making plans. One of them was going to use the extra income to start a food truck business. Other people were just relieved they'd be able to provide more for their children.
Dennis told us his story while we sat on the steps of City Hall. And he's a pragmatic guy. The 36-year-old says he's done everything from scrub floors to own his own insurance company. And he simply wanted to save some money.
The city's new wage rules meant he would be taking home a few extra $100 a month.
I personally threw a party. Yeah, a small get-together because it felt like what I would imagine was the big win of desegregation or women's suffrage or maybe not as well publicized up into the point of it changing as those things and many others, but a social ill having been bandaged a bit. this was a really big deal. Subsequently, I was able to save about $30 to $40 a week for the past couple of weeks. Not every week, because obviously $10 a week is or an hour is still not easy to navigate budget-wise, but it was a lot better.
It didn't last. Even though the city had the backing of the Missouri Supreme Court, which ruled St. Louis could raise its minimum wage, politicians were not impressed.
In fact, the GOP-controlled legislature spent its spring writing a law of its own, a state rule banning Missouri cities from raising their own minimum wages.
It also totally wiped out the minimum wage increase in St. Louis and Kansas City. Kansas City's minimum wage hike never went into effect.
But by the time the legislature passed its bill, workers throughout St. Louis, like Dennis, were getting larger paychecks. Certified nursing assistant Alexis Strotter got a 30-cent raise.
It made a big difference. I seen a big change in my normal paychecks with trying to pay rent and buy food and things like that. I had a little money to play with regarding my 2 children, like paying tuition, because tuition's not cheap when you have 2 little girls. Also, my daughter does track and she has asthma, so medication is not cheap at all.
Strotter was already having to work lots of overtime to try to make her budget work.
I work on a psychiatric health floor, but I work all over the building, Medicaid, G-tubes, hospice, things like that people be like, oh, well, you just wipe butt. But at the same time, we're also caring for people's loved ones. So why couldn't we get a decent way of living if we're caring for someone that's basically then paved the way for us to live? So I feel very passionate in what I do. You know, because I feel like me and my coworkers are worth it. I feel like my kids are worth it. If we stay at $7.70 as minimum wage, what do our future look like in St. Louis? It's already a high crime city. The kids really don't have that much to do. You know, how can we make sure our kids are taken care of after we're gone?
But lawmakers thought St. Louis was rocking the state's economic boats. State Senator Dan Hegeman, a Republican from a rural part of northwest Missouri, handled the bill to roll back St. Louis's wage increase.
Fundamentally, we need to have a uniform, consistent minimum wage across the state so that we don't pit communities against each other.
Hegeman wasn't the only one who felt this way. Missouri's new governor, Republican Eric Greitens, a guy who used to live in St. Louis, shares Hegeman's philosophy, and he ultimately let the bill go into effect without his signature, which is basically the same thing as signing it.
Despite the promises of liberal politicians and politicians in the city of St. Louis, the policy that they engage with would have actually had the exact opposite effect. It would have led to fewer jobs and lower pay.
Is raising the minimum wage good for a city's economy? That's an open question because the trend to raise the wage at the local level is new enough that there's not a lot of long-term data.
And the research out there is mixed. Take Seattle, for example. Over the past 3 years, the city has gradually raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Research from the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. Man, that isn't a very academic-sounding institution.
Wow.
Anyways, yes, very official sounding. Anyways, they say it has been good for Seattle's workers and the overall economy.
But researchers from the University of Washington say that as the wage was phased in, it led to cutbacks in both low-wage workers' jobs and hours.
Some people, though, have questioned the methodology of that study from the University of Washington. We're not going to go deep into the weeds here. We're not economists.
We aren't. But you get the point. The research is pretty murky when it comes to the economic impact for workers in cities so far.
What is clear, though, is that for thousands of workers here in St. Louis, the wage whiplash has been devastating.
Dennis, the grocer, said that he knew his higher pay wasn't completely safe. About a year ago, he testified in front of a state legislative committee pleading on behalf of low-wage workers. The reception, he says, wasn't encouraging.
The one thing that I recall from, and I keep calling it an incident because it really was not a positive thing in my memory. It was not positive. What I recall was particularly two of the Congress persons looking at not just myself, but the entirety of the room as though we were saying things that had already been prejudged, like as though the room was filled to capacity, all for naught. Why are you guys here?
Dennis found out he would lose his raise by reading about it in the newspaper. His employer, the privately held Schnucks, released a statement saying it would not be paying its employees $10 an hour if it didn't have to.
And at the end of August, Dennis's paychecks shrunk. The ordeal made him physically sick. His doctors urged him to reduce his stress. Instead, he went looking for a second job. Suddenly, the replacement cell phone he'd gotten his girlfriend after hers broke was now a strain.
Had my phone off, disconnected for about 4 days. My girl, we're on the same plan. Hers was off. As I said, she's carrying child, so that added another level of stress. Now the phone situation is handled. I've had to make some other moves, get some other things done. There's still, a nice, significant in the red in my bank account, but I'm hopeful.
Dennis was able to find a second job. He works as a restaurant server a few days a week.
When you get into a low-wage work environment, these things that at one point were kind of incidental aren't incidental anymore. It's not just about having kids in the home. It's not about me not being able to, take my girl on a date or anything of that nature. No, it's not those things that are so pertinent. It's the point of, okay, which bill do I pay this week? Because my pay period has fallen in the middle of the month and I only have this amount with which to pay it. And before I had a little bit more. I can't even tell you how stressful it is. The kids definitely notice when you're dragging. You don't want to bounce baby on your leg as much as you would like to. You don't wake up as bouncy as you'd like to. The dragging is a bit of an issue. That's life. I am an adult man, and I do enjoy working. But to work for so little that necessitates me to make more at the cost of spending that family time is it's demoralizing. It is demoralizing.
That brings us back to Lou Prince, the retired record store owner who's been signing up businesses here in St. Louis who pledged to keep the $10 minimum wage. On our walk down Cherokee Street, he stops inside Teatopia, a little 3-table cafe.
How you doing, man? Good to see you.
Lou spots his friend Kavi Razani sitting at one of the tables.
Kavi owns 3 businesses in the area and says he was quick to sign the pledge.
Walking into a business that pays a fair wage means that you're not just going to get a cup of coffee. You're contributing to the livelihood of real people, real working class people that are working in an environment where they are also being valued at that rate.
Even though he's a one-man operation for the time being, the cafe's owner, Reginald Quarles, also signed the pledge. For him, it's a sign of solidarity.
It shows that we're starting to stand together. Whether it's independent business, entrepreneurs, they're all coming together and starting to, come together as one. And that's more what we need. And we've been divided and conquered to some extent. So now we're trying to reclaim our power back.
But the reality is that the majority of workers who would benefit from a wage hike work for large companies, like Schnucks, the grocery chain that employs Dennis, or McDonald's.
Political groups and unions that support raising the wage say now it's going to be up to the people, not politicians. In the last several weeks, activists and organizers have begun collecting signatures to put the issue to the people.
If they're successful, the matter will go on the state ballot, and every voter in Missouri will get to choose whether the minimum wage will go up to $12 an hour by 2023.
Stepping back outside, Lou says he knows they're in for a fight.
Businesses that don't want to participate in the communities they live in are going to fight hard and are going to spend a ton of money here to defeat this, because we're the flagship state for it in a lot of ways.
So we want to make sure that we give a very, very special and heartfelt thank you to our colleague and political reporter Jason Rosenbaum, who helped out a ton with this episode.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
And so this issue is ongoing, and if you want to keep up on the latest twists and turns, you can follow Jason's reporting at our website, stlpublicradio.org, or look him up on Twitter. He's kind of a funny guy, posts goofy stuff on Twitter sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And We Live Here is produced by me, Tim Lloyd.
And me, Camille Stanley.
Shula Newman is the executive editor of St. Louis Public Radio.
And from St. Louis Public Radio and PRX, this is We Live Here.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.